Welcome to Coaching with Confidence and Care podcast, inspired by common topics that arise in coach training, mentoring, and supervision. I'm Lubomir Samidze, the founder of Upthink Coaching. I'm an active coach trainer, mentor, and supervisor. If you're listening, you're probably looking to deepen your skills as a coach. I hope this podcast will be a helpful resource for you and contributes to your journey. This podcast episode was inspired by one of my coaching mentees, like most episodes are. We had a chat before her mentoring session, and I casually asked her how the coaching session went before she submitted her recording. She said the session didn't go well because the client didn't make progress. This evaluation made me curious. I know this isn't uncommon for coaches to judge their coaching ability by their client's progress or lack thereof. At the end of the day, we are helping professionals, supporting our clients in achieving their goals. But is the client's progress only in our hands? What are visible and invisible processes that influence that? What does progress actually mean in coaching, and what can we do in order to enhance it? I thought it could be helpful to record a podcast episode that would cover all these questions and share my experience, not only as a coach, but also as a mentor coach and a coaching supervisor. When we talk about progress in coaching, we usually mean something that we can observe, visible movement toward the client's goals. Although not all results can be guaranteed because there can be some external circumstances or the scope of the change could be greater than our client had initially anticipated. You would expect at least to make some progress towards their goals. But what happens when everyone involved defines progress differently? It gets even more complex if you do sponsored coaching. That is, your client's organization is paying for their coaching. Coaches are expected to prove that coaching is working. And sponsors, like line managers or HR partners, often have their own criteria for what counts as progress. The coach, meanwhile, may have a different view. And the client? So now we've got three perspectives, and they don't always align. Progress indicators are never neutral. They're always filtered through someone's lens. The coaches, the sponsors, or the clients. Which brings us back to a core tension in coaching. Whose agenda is being served? If we are not clear on that, then even our best efforts to measure success can miss the point. I won't go too deep into a three-party contracting in this episode as it's nuanced and I believe it deserves its own episode. I won't go into different levels of results that a client may get from coaching either. That is not exclusively behavior change or a new habit or an action step. I definitely want to address this in one of the future episodes. So in this very episode, I will only focus on the dynamics between a coach and a client that can be observed and addressed within a single coaching session. When there's a feeling that your client is not making progress in the session. And I'm planning to address a few different areas. I'll start with visible progress indicators and what could be affecting those. Then I'll talk a bit about the client's process, the coach's process, and the process between client and coach. Let's dive right in. Speaking of the visible progress indicators, one of the first examples that comes to mind is when a coach is measuring client's progress by the number of insights or loud ahas in the session. Wow, that was a life-changing question. I've never thought of that before. That's amazing. That's a major breakthrough for me. And if a coach is hoping to hear these words in order to see that their client is progressing, they may get disappointed. The truth is that sometimes the client's process is not that loud. Not everyone is experiencing aha moments immediately. Some people really need longer time for insights to emerge. In sessions, they may experience a quieter integration of what is going on. A coach's attachment and sometimes even obsession with aha moments may lead to disappointment because in this case, a coach may try to perform to impress the client with a question and the session becomes more performance-oriented rather than offering deep presence, respecting the client's pace and meaningful progress on their terms. A coach who's dissatisfied with the progress may show the dissatisfaction to the client, and their client may feel the pressure to perform so that they don't look silly in front of their coach. If you see that your client starts getting a bit anxious or shows discomfort because they're not moving forward as much as they had expected, ask yourself whether they may be getting this impatience and sense of urgency from you. The way to manage this dynamic could be to catch your inner evaluator and bring yourself back to presence. Ask yourself, do I feel the need to impress my client or to prove to them that I'm doing my best work? Another indicator that the client is not progressing or that may give you a feeling that they're not progressing is that they're discussing something that is not so meaningful to them. And you sense that their topic is not a real topic. You might see that the client is circling around something, but they're not going into that. The agenda seems to be surface level or imposed. Maybe the visible topic could be a placeholder for a deeper theme. And the question here is, how do you address this? If you feel that your coachee is staying at the surface level, do you choose to stay at the surface level as well? Although you might sense that this is not the real topic, this could be an avoidance strategy. I think it's always best to be straightforward, gentle but straightforward. Reflect this back to your client and say something like, is this the real conversation you want to have today? Invite them to explore a deeper significance of the conversation or of what they want to achieve. You can hold a conversation about their values or take it to the identity level and see if they're operating from external expectations or from their internal drivers and motivations. We can deepen our contracting by aligning with their identity level change, not just task-based goals. I'd also say here that it is important to trust your intuition and discern between judgment and intuition. As coaches, we are always taught to stay non-judgmental, but at the same time, we need to understand that judgments are based on our own biases, previous experiences, beliefs, preferences, thoughts, our own patterns, and there are real signals that we are receiving from the client and from the space between us. Intuition is real and valid. You are developing it as a superpower if you are doing the work. If you're going through a coach training, if you coach your clients, if you reflect on your work in mentoring and supervision, you become a professional listener and a professional sensor of the environment. And if you're cutting off your intuition and you're not accessing it in your coaching sessions, you're giving up a big part of what you have developed. As a mentor coach, I often see that. I often ask my mentees, so did you have a hunch about this session? Something about the client maybe, or the topic? Did you feel something that you didn't say or address maybe? And oftentimes they're sharing those ideas with me. And in those moments, as an observer, because I listened to the session as well, I could actually see the validity of their intuition. I might be sensing similar things as an observer or something along the same lines. So I do invite you to trust your sensing skills, not just your ability to hear what's being said. Revealing what is truly wanting attention can be a crucial part of the conversation, especially if you want the client to make real progress, not just pay lip service to the topic. Another sign that could make you doubt about your client's progress could be a lower level of energy and their engagement in the session. When you feel that your client is getting stuck internally and maybe they're battling with some resistance, but it does not get discussed. When clients immerse into their own head and they're not staying fully present with you throughout the session, this is when it becomes really difficult to support them the way we do. Emotions are never a detour in coaching. They're always data that we can use. There could be some shame or guilt that's causing resistance, and it's difficult to overcome. Supporting the client in naming some hard feelings could be one of the ways to start liberating them from those feelings and addressing the deeper resistance that is affecting their client's progress in the conversation. I will revisit this a little bit later in this episode when I talk about the client's progress. Last but not least, and it also belongs to the definition of progress, is that your client is actually progressing, but it is not visible. They may be shifting internally, and internal shifts often come with disorientation, reevaluation, and slower meaning making. Remember that experience needs time to get integrated. And this theme stood out in some coaching research before, the paradox of progress indicators. A coach might think, this isn't going anywhere, the client seems stuck. On the surface, nothing's moving. But that perception may be misleading. If the coach asks the client directly for feedback, the client may reveal that a lot is happening, just not in the sessions. The work was internal, and it was integrating elsewhere. Sometimes progress is only visible from the inside, and only if you ask. How many times have you actually heard a client say, I understand all this, and in my mind, it makes perfect sense? However, when it comes to taking action, I simply can't do this. This may be partially due to skipping this assimilation and integration stage. Once we are aware of this inner process, we will not rush the client and we will not mistakenly label it as lack of progress. We can let this sink, hold space, help our clients celebrate their reflection and honor their reflection, not just tasks and action plans and behaviors. There is another side to this too. Situations when the coach sees clear signs of progress, but the client doesn't recognize it as such. I've had coaches in supervisions who reflected that if the client doesn't see it, then it doesn't count as progress. That is why regularly checking in with your clients and helping them see what's shifting is crucial. Now I want to speak about the coach's internal process. And the first thing I want to address is overdoing the work. Simply speaking, when the coach is working harder than their client. From the systemic point of view, it may look like a repair behavior. There's imbalance in the system, and one part of the system, that is the client, starts to disengage, and another part of the system, the coach, starts to overreact to restore some balance in the system. However, by doing so, are we stepping into the client's challenge? Are we interfering with their process? That is not the only intervention that we can do in such situations. If it's your turn to respond in a coaching session, it doesn't have to be your super active engagement and taking this all in your own hands. Sometimes staying with a client in this not knowing and letting these unknowns reach a peak can actually help the client understand where they want the conversation to go. Hand the process back. You don't have to be the one who knows where to go. You don't have to be the one always rescuing the conversation. The conversation is co-owned, co-created. This is an important part of our work. I had a similar situation earlier this week actually, when my client said, I don't know. And then I told the client, oh, you're saying you don't know? Well, I don't know either. What if the answer needs a bit more time to emerge? How do you feel about staying with me in this not knowing and seeing what question will want to emerge in this space? And actually the results were brilliant. We sat with a not knowing, a new direction emerged for the client, and that is where we went. It was experimentation that we both embraced, and it also added some lightness into our conversation and brought some ease into that, so ideas started to flow. Another process that may be coming from the coach is when a coach leads their client, intentionally or unintentionally. A coach may have their own agenda or session direction which they think serves the client better. And I know from my own experience as a client in sessions that when I feel led and my process is discounted and my coach prioritizes their own insights and thinks they know better, I start to disengage. I start to sabotage it. I don't feel like sharing. I don't feel heard. And I know the energy leaves the room. If you feel that your client starts to disengage, my invitation for you would be to come back to curiosity. Even when it feels messy, let the client move at their own pace. Here's another example from my own coaching session earlier this week. Whichever question I asked, the client seemed to know the answer, and she was so ready to jump in and say, "Hey, I know the answer to that. I know why this is happening." So I decided to give up my intention to question her, and after some silence I said, "I'm not asking you any questions because you seem to know all the answers. So I'm also assuming you might know how to get out of this stuckness. Where do you need to go further in this conversation to find a way out?" And it worked really well for her. So if you're noticing your client's disengagement, another thing to reflect on could be your role. Whether you've taken an expert role or the role of a leader, or maybe jumped into a rescuer mode, which made you ask even more questions to remedy the situation. It may be not about your questions at all. Maybe it's the roles and agendas that need addressing and revisiting. Now, earlier I said there could be something about the client's progress that contributes to a visible lack of progress. And one of the things that I want to address here is your client's readiness for the actual change. You know, one of the models that we teach in our coach training program at Upthink Coaching is Prochaska's and DiClemente's trans-theoretical model of change, which explains different stages of readiness. Change is a complex process, and it requires a specific kind of commitment. If your client knows they should talk about change, take action, shift their behavior or mindset, but the deeper commitment isn't really there, they may still engage in the conversation, say the right things, and tell themselves and you that the change has begun. But often, that is just lip service. It creates the feeling of movement without the real action. In such situations, you might sense that you're going around in circles. There's no energy in this conversation. There's no commitment, no action, no follow through. And this could be the reason why your client is not progressing. They haven't yet arrived internally to the stage where they are ready to do something. Your awareness of the stages of change could help you have a very insightful chemistry call or discovery session with your client that actually explores their readiness for change. That could be one of the determining factors of the progress that your client makes in sessions. Another client's process that I believe is worth mentioning is when a client experiences resistance because they sense that they are approaching a place of a deeper vulnerability and they're not sure they're ready to go there. This is when it may become tricky. In such situations, it may feel like there's a lot of unsaid things in the space, and the client may be sensing something they don't want to acknowledge. Maybe they're not ready to have this conversation with themselves. Maybe they're not ready to have it with you. You're sensing something, and you may be choosing not to address that either. Or maybe you're brushing off those thoughts altogether, and maybe you're thinking, okay, I'll just try something else in order to remedy their situation and get them to talk. And to me, it looks like a few separate stories that are emerging, two separate processes, instead of a co-created, shared process, and this is not helping anyone. Whether or not the client chooses to go deeper into their vulnerability, that is entirely up to them. We can't force someone into a vulnerable space, even if we sense that it could lead to growth or be profoundly productive. Consent matters. Coaching is co-created and collaborative. We are not here to push or lead. We are here to meet them where they are. So we can gently name that the conversation is touching something tender. We can stay present. And we can hold the space with care because often that fragile place carries the greatest potential for real change. The best way we can support here is to keep actively maintaining a safe space, partner and contract around our coaching style. I personally believe that a coaching session is the right place to have an honest conversation with yourself. So I intentionally create conditions supporting my clients to be more courageous in sessions and accompany them into that vulnerable space. For example, my own personal style is the combination of courageous challenge, very straightforward communication, gutsy approach, and at the same time, genuine deep care and respect and partnership. When I contract with my clients, I tell them, here's the style that I find helpful, and I have feedback from my clients and I see their progress that proves it. And I say something like, I understand that this style may not resonate with everyone. So before each session, I'm going to contract with you around the balance of challenge versus care that we agreed to have in this particular session today. How comfortable are you with that? And if a vulnerable moment arises in a session, I will check with you one more time what approach I should be taking here with you in that conversation. Speaking of vulnerability, I always believe that it's something that you can bring into the space with care. Sometimes all it takes is a gentle naming, like, I'm sensing we are stepping into a really vulnerable place here. Let me know how you are feeling about this and whether you're open to going deeper. But if your client is willing and you've contracted for that level of honesty, the invitation can be more direct. You might say, I'm sensing some avoidance here. What's coming up for you? What might you be avoiding? And in some cases, if the trust is strong and the moment calls for it, you might go even further. That sounds like a pretty story you're telling yourself. What's the truth here? What matters is that it's not about being mean. You are not challenging for the sake of it. You are holding up a mirror with care. And again, when I do this, I only do this with the consent of my clients, and they know I might do that. So when the moment is right and I'm sensing that we are relationally close and present for each other, I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing this for them, it's always perceived in a positive way with gratitude. Well, since we've already started talking about the relationship between client and coach, let's see what might be getting in the way of progress here, if that's really the case. The most obvious thing here could be lack of deeper trust. Of course, if your client hired you as a coach, they trust you enough to have sessions with you, but conversation can land on very different levels. Some truths are so uncomfortable that the client may not even want to admit them to themselves, let alone say them out loud. It takes real depth and a great deal of vulnerability to acknowledge the parts of ourselves that we are not proud of. And just because this might come easily to you as a coach, it doesn't mean it's easy for the person sitting across from you. Trust is dynamic, it shifts constantly. It's not a fixed state. It's something that grows or weakens based on how we respond moment to moment inside the coaching relationship. So when you start sensing that your client is holding back, one courageous move could be to pause, reconnect human to human, and ask for feedback, not to pressure, but to invite. When you model emotional transparency, clients often feel the safety to lean in just a little more. Sometimes that's all it takes for the real conversation to begin. In such situations, I might say something like, I'm noticing I'm not sure what's really going on for you right now. Is there something that feels hard to name? Or, I want to check with you, does this feel like a space where you can say what's really true for you? Or does something feel off? My clients know I may ask these kind of questions. When I explain my approach, I tell them that I'm not only staying with their story, but I am staying with them as a person, and I'm staying in complete contact with the energy in the space and everything that's happening between us. So, as a result, I may be addressing our relational dynamics. That is the process between us. And the purpose of doing that is that a lot of patterns that are happening between us are the patterns that are being repeated from your own story, from your own life. And if there is an unproductive pattern, that unhelpful pattern may have an impact on the outcome. And I would love to be able to address it for their benefit. So I'm asking them how comfortable they are with that, because I know if I start withholding something, that may create a lot of unproductive dynamic. And as a result, the client may be unhappy with the session outcome. That's all I wanted to talk about today. We may not have a perfect session every single time, but I hope that you can maintain a curious, open-minded stance and remain sensitive to the session dynamics, because what is happening with a session, with a conversation, reveals the way your client is actually thinking and perceiving their situation at that time. I guess one of the key ideas in this episode is that if a client isn't progressing in the session, don't take it all on yourself. It is not always about your coaching skills. In fact, most of the time, it's not about the doing of coaching. More often, it's about the being of coaching. It is about whether you're attuned to deeper patterns, emotional themes, relational dynamics, whether you are willing to name what is unspoken in the space, and that takes courage and practice. So if you feel like you are getting stuck again and again, it might be worth exploring your being skills more intentionally through mentoring, supervision, or additional training. If you feel like sharing your ideas or experiences with me, do reach out on LinkedIn. I love to connect with other coaches. If you found this episode helpful, I'd be truly grateful if you passed it along to fellow coaches or anyone who might benefit from it. And if you want to go deeper into this kind of work, the real emotional and relational side of coaching, our Level 2 program opens again in September. You'll find all the details on our website if you are curious, www.upthinkcoaching.com, or message me on LinkedIn. I'll send you a direct link to the program. I'm always happy to connect. Next time, I'm talking about 3-party agreements, how to handle the dynamic when there is a client, a sponsor, and you in the mix. If you've ever coached inside an organization, you know it can get complicated fast. Whose agenda are we following? Who gets to know what? What happens when the sponsor wants results and the client wants space? It's not always straightforward, and if we don't contract clearly at the start, it can derail the whole engagement. So, we're gonna go there. Join me for that conversation. I think it's one every coach should be having. Talk soon.